Pack your bags tomorrow. You are going to this place," my son-in-law told me, throwing a crumpled brochure of a nursing home that smelled of confinement and abandonment right in my face. I am Lucy. I am 73 years old, and I make my living fixing antique clocks, giving time back to what others consider dead. He forgot that the papers to this house, the very one he walked through with such arrogance, were locked away in my workshop, ready to be used. The paper of the brochure was that cheap, glossy kind that slips through your fingers, printed in saturated colors, to fake a joy that nobody in their right mind would believe. It landed right on my plate, staining the edge with a streak of the sauce I had spent the entire afternoon simmering on low heat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't immediately look away. I simply watched the trajectory of the paper, the way it touched down, and then I raised my eyes to Mason. He stood on the other side of the table, chest puffed out, breathing with that heavy rhythm of a man who just made a cowardly decision and desperately needs to convince himself it was an act of bravery. Beside him, my daughter Jenna kept her eyes glued to the linen tablecloth, tracing the outline of the embroidery with her index fingernail, entirely incapable of holding my gaze. The silence that settled into the dining room wasn't an empty silence. It was the dull thud of an irreparable fracture, the sound of an internal clock whose mainspring had just snapped. To understand how we arrived at this exact second, at this sauce-stained brochure resting on my oak table, you have to rewind and examine the gears of the mechanism. My mind has always worked like this, cataloging events, measuring tensions, analyzing the wear and tear of the cogs before the machine collapses. Arthur, my late husband, used to say I had ice in my veins and a caliper in my brain. When he passed away 15 years ago, I didn't collapse into theatrical weeping. I organized the funeral, paid the outstanding debts, filed his documents in color-coded folders by year, and kept maintaining this two-story house we built together, brick by brick, back in 1978. This house is not just a roof. It is the physical ledger of my existence. I know the exact creak of the third wooden step leading to the second floor. I know exactly how many minutes it takes for the water to heat up in the master bathroom's pipes. I know the precise angle of the sunlight when it cuts through the living room window at 4 in the afternoon in the dead of winter, illuminating the dust motes suspended in the air. Mason and Jenna moved in here 3 years and 4 months ago. I know that for a fact because I jotted the date down in the margin of my ledger. They arrived with a half-empty moving truck, the pale face of my daughter, my grandson Finn, clutching a blue backpack and a grandiose speech from my son-in-law about a temporary transition. Mason's import business had gone bankrupt. It wasn't bad luck, it wasn't the economy, and it wasn't some market conspiracy, no matter how much he repeated it. It broke down out of pure, unadulterated, mathematical incompetence. I had, quietly, without being asked, reviewed the balance sheets he carelessly left scattered on the kitchen counter. He spent more on client dinners and custom suits than on actual inventory. He was a man built on appearances, a plastic mechanism wrapped in a gold-plated shell, desperately trying to pass for solid gold. I didn't say a word back then. I opened the door, gave them the guest bedroom, then allowed them to take over the sewing room for Finn's toys. And slowly, methodically, silently, they began to colonize my spaces. The invasion was gradual, like dampness creeping up a poorly sealed wall. First, it was the schedules. The entire house had to adapt to Mason's erratic rhythm. He would wake up at noon, demanding absolute silence all morning. Because, according to him, he worked until dawn hunting for investors on the internet. Then came the meals. Jenna, exhausted from pulling double shifts at an insurance office to plug her husband's financial sinkholes, stopped cooking altogether. I took over that duty not out of submission, but out of sheer efficiency, and because Finn needed proper nutrition. I prepared the breakfasts, the lunches, the dinners. I washed the dishes. I ironed the school uniforms with the steady precision of someone adjusting the hand of a chronograph. Every one of Finn's shirts had perfect creases. Every morning, I was up at 5:30, grinding the coffee, making the toast, organizing the day before the rest of the house even opened their eyes. My labor was completely invisible to them. Mason consumed the plates I set in front of him without ever saying thank you, often complaining that the meat was overcooked, or that he preferred a different roast of coffee. "You're getting old, Lucy," he would tell me with that condescending smirk, wiping his mouth with the cloth napkin I had personally washed and starched. "You don't understand how the world works anymore. Everything is speed. Everything is risk. You're stuck in the last century with your little wind-up gadgets." I listened to him without altering my expression. I picked up his plate, carried it to the sink, and mentally logged another past-due bill the mailman had dropped off that morning in his name. Another collection notice he would try to hide under the fruit bowl. My silence was never weakness. It was simply data collection. An investigator doesn't interrupt a crime scene to scold the thief, they just document. The only place in the house that remained untouchable was my workshop. It sits in the back, right next to the lemon tree patio. It's a small room with a solid wood workbench full of tiny compartments, cold light lamps, and magnifying loupes. I spend my afternoons in there, surrounded by precision tweezers, millimeter screwdrivers, and microscopic vials of lubricant. Watchmaking is a craft that tolerates zero deception. If a part is worn out, the watch stops. You can't sweet-talk a gear with motivational speeches or modern business pitches. It requires truth, infinite patience, and an absolutely steady hand. From the window of my workshop, I have a clear view of the street and the neighborhood life that has bloomed around me for 4 decades. I know everyone. I know Martha, who runs the corner grocery and saves the best tomatoes for me. I know the boys down at the pharmacy. And above all, I know Ellis, the owner of the real estate agency 3 blocks down. A serious man, with whom Arthur and I shared countless Sundays down at the square. My life is woven into the grid of these streets. I am not an isolated old woman living in a bubble. I am a central node in a community that Mason, in his infinite arrogance, despises for being too small town. The tension reached its breaking point at the beginning of this month. Mason had been more irritable than usual. His so-called investors had stopped returning his calls. The debts were backing him into a corner. He started looking at the house differently. He no longer saw it as a temporary shelter, but as an untapped asset. I noticed it in the way his eyes measured the rooms, in how he knocked on the hallway walls, calculating which load-bearing structures to tear down. One afternoon, Jenna walked into my workshop. She was pale, deep dark circles bruising her face, a face that was once so vibrant. She rubbed her hands together, nervous, dodging my direct gaze. She told me they needed more space, that Finn was growing, that Mason needed a real office to finally close his deals and get out of his slump. She suggested, with the trembling voice of someone reciting a forced script, that the house was too big for me alone, that maybe I would be more comfortable in a smaller place where I wouldn't have to worry about maintenance. I pulled the loupe away from my eye, rested my tweezers on the green felt mat, and stared right at her. I didn't argue with her. I just asked in a perfectly neutral tone who exactly was going to pay for this supposedly smaller place when they couldn't even cover this month's electric bill. Jenna lowered her head and walked out of the workshop without answering. That was the prelude, the final confirmation that the mechanism of our cohabitation was about to fail. And that brings us to tonight, Thursday. 57 degrees outside. Dinner was served. I had made beef stew, Finn's favorite. Even though the boy was up in his room finishing homework and hadn't come down yet, Mason sat at the table without washing his hands. He was wearing a shirt I had ironed that very morning. Jenna poured the water, carefully avoiding clinking the glasses. The air was thick, heavy with that static electricity that precedes a dry thunderstorm. Mason took a couple of bites, chewed without enthusiasm, and then dropped his silverware onto the plate with an aggressive metallic clatter. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and locked his eyes on me. Lucy! He started using that tone of fake respect that always preceded a demand. I've been running some numbers. This situation is no longer sustainable. The house is old, it needs repairs you can't afford, and we need to expand. I have a project lined up that requires me to host clients here, and frankly, the atmosphere just isn't right. I kept cutting a small piece of meat. My movements were slow, deliberate. I looked him in the eye, waiting for him to finish his rehearsed monologue. Jenna and I have made a decision, he continued, and I watched my daughter shrink a little further into her chair, hearing her name dragged into that sentence. It's for your own good. You need to rest. You need a place where they take care of you, where you don't have to worry about cooking or cleaning. You're an elderly woman now. You are a burden to the progress of this family by clinging to a house that is way too big for you. The word hung suspended in the air. Burden, an interesting term coming from a man who had spent 39 months living under my roof, eating my food, using my hot water, and sleeping in beds I bought. A man whose only verifiable income in the last 3 years had been the lies he fed his wife. I didn't feel emotional outrage. I felt the cold clarity of a confirmed diagnosis. My analysis was correct. The parasite had decided it was time to devour the host in order to survive. That was when he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out the paper. He unfolded it with a sharp flick of his wrist and tossed it onto the table. The brochure slid across the tablecloth until it bumped against my plate. Sunset Residences, it read in golden cursive letters right next to a stock photo of smiling seniors in an artificial garden. I knew exactly what that place was. It was out past the city limits, a state-funded storage unit for forgotten elders, notorious for being understaffed and reeking of industrial bleach. It was the cheapest place he could find. Pack your bags tomorrow. You're going to this place, he pronounced, hitting every syllable to project authority. I called this afternoon and they have a bed available. We have decided to mortgage this house to inject capital into my new company. You will sign the rights transfer papers first thing tomorrow morning before you leave. Don't worry, I'll handle all the paperwork. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock behind me. It was a pendulum clock I had calibrated myself a decade ago. It lost barely 2 seconds a month. I looked at the brochure, then I looked at Jenna, my daughter. The little girl I had taught to read. The woman I had held when she cried from sheer exhaustion. Kept her head down. There was no surprise on her face. She knew. She had consented. The weight of that betrayal hurt, of course, but my analytical mind quickly encapsulated the pain to process it later. Right now, there was no room for tears. I had an operational problem to solve. Are you on board with this, Jenna? I asked. My voice came out clear, unwavering, with the precision of a scalpel. She swallowed hard, moving her lips a couple of times before any sound came out. Mom, Mason is right. It's what's best for everyone. We need the money from the house to get ahead. You'll be well taken care of there. We'll come visit you on Sundays." I nodded slowly, a single, deliberate movement of my head. The evidence was complete. The case was closed. Mason was watching me with a half smile, convinced that my lack of hysterics was a sign of surrender. He expected screaming. He expected begging. He expected the fragility of a frightened old woman. He didn't understand that my calm was the direct result of knowing exactly how many cards I held in my hand, and knowing the rules of the game far better than he did. "Tomorrow," I repeated in a whisper, almost to myself. "First thing tomorrow," he confirmed, rapping his knuckles on the table. "So I suggest you start packing your things. You don't need to bring much. They give you a uniform there." I didn't say another word. I stood up from the oak chair. I didn't push my plate away. I didn't throw the brochure. I made no gesture of rage. I simply stood up, back perfectly straight, smoothing the skirt of my dress. I walked toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Behind me, I heard Mason exhale loudly, muttering something about how easy that had been, and "I told you the old lady wouldn't be a problem." I walked into my bedroom and closed the door without a sound. I turned on the nightstand lamp. The yellow light washed over the perfectly made bed, the dark wood wardrobe, the dresser where I kept my photographs. I went straight to the corner where I store my luggage. I pulled out a small brown leather suitcase, sturdy and practical. I opened it on the bed. My mind was operating with glacial efficiency. I wasn't packing out of obedience. I was packing out of strategy. I packed 3 changes of clothes, a comfortable pair of shoes, my toiletries. Then I walked into my workshop, which connected to my bedroom through an interior door. The shop was dark-lit, only by the street lamp filtering through the glass. I went straight for the wall safe bolted behind the parts shelf. I spun the combination from memory. 4 turns right, 2 left, 1 right. The heavy mechanism yielded with a dull click. From inside, I pulled out a thick plastic folder. Inside were the house deeds, the property titles, the tax records, everything in my name, flawlessly up to date. Mason, in his supreme stupidity, had assumed that because I was married to Arthur, the house had automatically passed into some manageable legal limbo after his death. He never bothered to investigate that the property was bought solely in my name from day one, using money from my own family inheritance, and that he had absolutely zero legal authority to mortgage so much as a brick on the exterior wall. I also grabbed my main tool roll, my favorite tweezers, my loops, the digital caliper, the things that defined me. I placed the folder and the tool roll into the suitcase. I zipped it shut, slipped on my gray wool coat, wrapped my scarf around my neck, and grabbed the handle. I left the bedroom and walked down the hall toward the front door. Passing the archway to the dining room, I stopped for a fraction of a second. They were still sitting there. Mason was pouring himself another glass of wine, laughing at something already celebrating his imaginary victory. Jenna was staring blankly at the wall. Neither of them saw me in the shadows of the hallway. I watched the scene the way you observe a malfunctioning machine that is beyond repair. I had spent 3 years lubricating their gears, absorbing their friction, keeping this household running at the expense of my own energy. And this was the currency I was paid in a charity asylum and property theft. I didn't feel sorry for myself. I felt a deep, freezing pity for them, for the profound ignorance of believing they could discard me like an old piece of furniture without facing the consequences of gravity. I turned on my heels, reached the solid wood front door, gripped the cold brass knob, and turned it slowly to avoid making a sound. I stepped out onto the front porch. The night was clear, and the cold air hit my face, waking up every nerve ending in my skin. The sky showed a few stars muted by the city glow. I walked down the tiled path to the sidewalk. I didn't look back. I pulled my cell phone from my coat pocket and dialed the number for the cab company that operated a few blocks from here. As I waited for the dispatcher to answer, my eyes drifted down to the corner of the street where the sign for Ellis's real estate agency glowed faintly under a streetlight. The network of my community was right there, asleep but present, waiting to be activated at the first light of dawn. The taxi arrived in under 5 minutes. The driver, a young kid I didn't recognize, got out to help me with my bag. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked, noting the late hour and my light luggage. "To the Central Avenue, the hotel across from the Civic Plaza," I replied, my voice steady and clear. I slid into the back seat. The engine hummed to life. Through the window, I watched the facade of my house pull away. The dining room lights were still on. Inside, an arrogant man and a cowardly woman believed they had won the game. They thought they controlled the board, completely oblivious to the fact that the owner of the board had just walked out with the pieces, the rules, and the entire table. I settled into the seat, closed my eyes for a moment, and began mentally reviewing the legal steps and the visits I would make first thing tomorrow. The time for patience was over. It was time for precision. And if there was one thing I knew how to do better than anyone else in this world, it was dismantling defective machinery piece by piece until nothing was left but the naked weight of the truth. I rested the plastic folder on my lap, feeling the heavy reality of the documents beneath my hands, and let the taxi carry me toward the start of the next day. The door to the house, my house, had closed behind me, and with it, its fate was sealed. The lobby of the Central Hotel smelled of floor wax and reheated coffee, a blend that brought back memories of the early mornings when Arthur and I would travel upstate hunting for watch parts. The night clerk was a young, skinny guy wearing a uniform slightly too big for him. He was nodding off behind the mahogany counter when the sound of my suitcase wheels rolling across the granite floor made him jump. He rubbed his eyes, blinked a couple of times, and his sleepy expression instantly morphed into genuine surprise.
"Miss Lucy,"
he asked, straightening up quickly and adjusting his tie.
"What are you doing here at this hour?"
I recognized him instantly. It was Sam Martha's grandson, the same kid whose grandfather's pocket watch I had repaired a couple of years back. A beautiful timepiece, a 1950 Longines that had arrived at my shop with a mainspring snapped right down the middle. "Good evening, Sam," I replied, stepping up to the counter with my back straight, resting both hands on the cold wood. "I need a single room, please, facing the street if possible. I like to hear the noise of the morning." Sam looked at my small suitcase and then up at my face. He didn't ask any impertinent questions. That is the advantage of belonging to a community where respect still carries weight. People know how to read the silences. He grabbed a key with a heavy brass tag from the back panel and handed it to me with both hands, as if offering an object of great value.
"Room 204. Miss Lucy, it's the quietest one on the second floor. Don't worry about checking in right now. I'll take care of the log. Let me help you with your bag."
"That's not necessary, son. It's light." I walked up the carpeted wooden stairs. Every step creaked at a different pitch, a symphony of old wood that felt strangely comforting. Stepping into the room, I flicked on the main light. It was modest, clean, featuring a bed with a white quilt, a small desk by the window, and a sliding door closet. I set the suitcase on the bed and took off my coat. I didn't feel sleepy. Cold, methodical adrenaline was pumping through my veins, keeping a steady rhythm. I walked over to the window, pulled back the heavy curtain, and looked out over the Civic Plaza. The street lamps illuminated the pruned trees and empty benches. The city slept, entirely ignorant of the petty betrayals brewing inside its houses. I pulled out my pocket watch, a Swiss mechanism I always keep pinned to my skirt. It was 2:15 in the morning. I popped it open. The sound of the escapement, that rapid, flawless ticking, filled the silence of the room. A watch works because every single piece assumes its responsibility. If one gear decides it wants to spin the opposite way, the entire machine paralyzes. Mason was that defective gear. And Jenna was the axle that had bent out of cowardice, allowing the friction to destroy the mechanism. I unzipped my suitcase and pulled out the thick plastic folder. I sat in the chair facing the desk. I switched on the reading lamp and spread the documents out across the surface. There was my life, written on paper. The original 1978 deed with the notary seals darkened by time. The clear title certificate I had updated out of pure habit barely 6 months ago. The property tax receipts, every single one, paid in my name. I traced my fingers over the rough paper of the deed. Arthur and I had agreed to put the house in my name because the down payment came from selling a piece of land my father left me when he died. "It's your safety net, Lucy," Arthur told me that afternoon at the notary's office. "Men are passing birds, but you are the solid ground." He was right. I spent the rest of the early morning reviewing every clause, every article of property law I already knew by heart. Mason had assumed an old woman's silence was synonymous with ignorance. He had swallowed the myth that older people become invisible, incapable of grasping the modern world of speed and risk he preached so much about. But business, just like clockwork, is governed by immutable laws. Paper rules all, and the paper stated clearly that I was the sole owner of every square inch of the property he planned to mortgage at sunrise. At 6 in the morning, sunlight started bleeding through the window, painting the desk in shades of orange. I stood up, walked into the bathroom, splashed freezing water on my face, and fixed my hair in the mirror. I put on a clean, conservative, dark blue dress and my walking shoes. There were no bags under my eyes, no trace of the victim Mason expected to find weeping in her bedroom. I went down to the lobby at exactly 7 o'clock. Sam had already been relieved by an older woman who greeted me with a nod. I stepped out onto the street. The morning air was sharp and clean. I walked with a steady pace down the central avenue. By this hour, my house was usually a circus of demands. Mason would be grunting about his shirt not being ready, Jenna would be running around looking for her car keys, and I would be serving breakfast, making sure Finn had his lunch packed in his backpack. Today, however, the only sound keeping me company was the rhythm of my own footsteps on the pavement. Before heading to the real estate agency, I detoured 2 blocks to Agnes's bakery. It was a neighborhood staple, with glass display cases fogged up from the heat of the ovens and the smell of freshly baked bread flooding the block. As I walked in, the bell on the door announced my arrival. Agnes, a sturdy woman with flour dusting her arms, looked up from the cash register. "Lord have mercy, Lucy," she exclaimed, wiping her hands on her apron. "I haven't seen you in here this early in months. You always send that son-in-law of yours, or you come rushing in the afternoon." "Good morning, Agnes. Routines change," I replied with a soft smile, stepping up to the counter. "Give me a black coffee, please. Make it strong." Agnes poured the coffee into a thick ceramic mug and slid it toward me, along with a steaming cheese roll. She looked at me with that sharp intuition you only get from spending years behind a counter, watching the neighborhood go by. "You look different, Lucy. You look like you're heading to war, but you ironed your uniform first." I took a sip of the coffee. The heat traveled down my chest, settling my thoughts. "Agnes, I want to ask you a question, and I need you to be completely honest. Does Mason owe you money for the breakfasts he picks up on the weekends?" The woman sighed. Her expression hardened, and she crossed her thick arms over her chest. She glanced out at the street before answering, lowering her voice. "That man is a phony, Lucy. I say this with all due respect because he's your daughter's husband. He owes me for over 2 months of bread ham and expensive cheeses. He always comes in with some story about leaving his wallet at home, or his investors wiring him money on Monday, or his cash being tied up in an offshore account. I put it on a tab for your sake because I know you're good for it. But honestly, I'm sick and tired of his delusions of grandeur. I nodded slowly. My diagnosis was being confirmed on every corner of the neighborhood. I opened my purse, pulled out my wallet, and extracted several high-denomination bills. I placed them flat on the glass counter. Ring up everything he owes you, down to the last penny, Agnes, and give me the receipt.
Lucy, you don't have to do this.
Just do it, please. I interrupted in a tone that brokered no debate. And listen to me carefully. From this moment on, do not front him a single crumb of bread. If Mason walks through that door asking for credit, you tell him his account is permanently closed. He pays cash or he walks out empty-handed. Agnes locked eyes with me for a long second, realizing that something structural had just shattered. She nodded, took the bills, and started punching numbers into the register. She handed me the change and an itemized receipt with Mason's name printed at the top. I tucked the paper into my purse with the exact same precision I used to place a microscopic gear. I finished my coffee, said goodbye to Agnes, and stepped back out into the street. It was 8:15. Ellis's real estate agency was only 3 blocks away, sitting on a prime corner of the main boulevard. When I arrived, Ellis was rolling up the metal security grate of his storefront. He was a 75-year-old man with impeccable posture, completely white hair, and suspenders that gave him the look of a vintage notary. Seeing me planted on the sidewalk with my plastic folder tucked under my arm, he stopped what he was doing and adjusted his glasses.
Lucy, what a surprise, he said, stepping over to kiss my cheek. Come in, come in. It's freezing out here. I was just about to put on the first pot of coffee.
I've already had coffee, Ellis, but I'll take the space. I need to talk to you. It's urgent. We walked into the office. It was a tidy place, lined with metal filing cabinets, zoning maps pinned to the walls, and a large conference table dead center. Ellis flipped on the lights, took off his coat, and sat behind his desk, gesturing for me to take the seat across from him. He noticed my rigid posture and the tight grip I had on the folder.
You didn't come here to talk about old times, did you?
He asked, interlacing his fingers on the desk, his tone instantly shifting to professional.
What's going on, Lucy?
I placed the folder on his desk and flipped it open. The smell of aged paper filled the space between us. Mason threw a brochure for the Sunset Residence's nursing home in my face last night. I began skipping the pleasantries, keeping my voice leveled. He ordered me to pack my bags because he's sending me there first thing today. He said the house is too big for me, that I'm a burden to the family's progress, and that he's mortgaging the property today to inject capital into some phantom project. Ellis's eyes went wide, his jaw clenched tight, and a flush of pure outrage crawled up his neck. He knew Arthur. He knew the blood and sweat it took us to put up those walls. That miserable son of a bitch dared to go that far, he muttered, slamming his palm flat against the desk. And Jenna, what did your daughter have to say about this atrocity? Jenna sat next to him, staring at the tablecloth. She agreed. She said it was what's best for everyone, and that they'd visit me on Sundays. Ellis closed his eyes for a second, digesting the sheer scale of the betrayal. Then he opened them and stared at the folder. But he can't mortgage a damn thing, Lucy. The house is in your name. I know that for a fact because I personally advised you to when you bought the lot in '78. I know that, but he doesn't know that. Or he thinks that because I'm a widow, the property slipped into some probate loophole he can manipulate. He assumes I'll sign whatever paper he shoves in my face out of pure intimidation. Ellis furrowed his brow, a mask of absolute concentration. He spun his chair toward the desktop computer next to him, put on his reading glasses, and started typing furiously. Let's check the public property registry system. I have direct access to the notary and bank databases. If that bastard is pulling strings, the paper trail will show up here. The silence in the office was broken only by Ellis's aggressive typing and the hum of the heater kicking on. I sat perfectly still watching his profile. For 3 years, Mason had strutted around my house like a peacock, talking about business networking market strategies, constantly belittling my trade as a watchmaker. He was about to find out that real power networks aren't built at fancy dinners with borrowed money. They are forged through decades of trust, honest handshakes, and the collective memory of a neighborhood. Here it is, Ellis said suddenly, his voice dripping with profound disgust. Lucy, look at this. I stood up and walked around the desk to look at the monitor. There was a digital form bearing the seal of a shady financial firm, the kind that dishes out predatory, high-interest, fast cash in exchange for real estate collateral. Yesterday afternoon, they submitted an application for mortgage pre-approval using your home address, Ellis explained, tapping the filled-out fields on the screen with his index finger. Mason is listed as the primary applicant, and look at this. Right here in the loan officer's notes, it says, client claims to hold full and sufficient power of attorney over the property owner who is currently undergoing a declaration of incapacitation due to senile dementia. I felt a sudden icy drop in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't pain. It was the absolute realization of how low he had actually sunk. He was going to lock me up in that asylum, not just to get me out of the way, but to use that confinement as medical proof of my supposed mental decline, giving him a blank check to strip my assets using a forged or coerced power of attorney. Declaration of incapacitation, I muttered, tasting the venom of the words. That was the master plan. That explained the rush, and why he picked the cheapest, most isolated facility available. That is a federal crime, Lucy. Attempted fraud, perjury, elder abuse, the list goes on, Ellis said, pulling away from the screen and looking me dead in the eye. The process is stalled in the system because the lender needs the original deeds and your physical signature in front of their notary to release the funds. That's why he demanded you sign today before leaving. I walked back to my chair and sat down slowly. A watchmaker knows that when you find a broken part, you don't smash it in a blind rage. You have to extract it with surgical precision so you don't damage the rest of the mechanism. I am not going to let them get away with this, Ellis. I am not going to argue with them. I'm not going to cry, and I'm not going to ask for explanations. What do you want to do? Should I call the police right now? No, I replied, holding up a hand. The police would scare him, but it wouldn't solve the root problem. He would still be living in my house. Jenna would still make excuses for him. Mason said last night that the house was too big for me. He said I was a burden to his progress. I want to give him exactly what he asked for. Ellis looked at me curiously, leaning forward. I want to sell the house, Ellis. Today. The real estate agent blinked, blindsided by the sheer force of my decision. Sell it, Lucy. That's your home. You have your whole life in there. My life is in my tools, and in my head, Ellis. That house with them inside it has become a hollow shell. If I don't sever this clean, they will keep draining my energy until I actually do end up in a nursing home. I want to list it for sale immediately, and I want them out of there. A slow, razor-sharp smile began to spread across Ellis's face. He took off his glasses and set them on the desk. "Lucy, I don't know if you keep up with this, but the zoning for your street changed 8 months ago. The city council approved low-density commercial buildings for that block. I have a developer, the Orango Group, who has been calling me every 2 weeks asking about your lot. They want that corner to build a boutique commercial plaza. They would pay you in cash, no mortgages, no delays, and for a price that triples what you think that house is worth." The information landed on the table with the weight of a gold brick. Mason wanted to mortgage the house for pennies at a second-rate loan shark to save a dead business. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting on a commercial gold mine simply because he never bothered to talk to the neighbors, never read the city notices, and never looked past his own inflated ego. "Call the Orango Group," I said, feeling an absolute unbreakable calm wash over me. "Tell them the property is available, and the deal closes today if they bring the paperwork." At that exact moment, the silence of the office was slashed by the ringing of my cell phone. I pulled it out of my coat pocket. Jenna's name flashed on the screen. I looked at Ellis and gave him a signal to stay quiet. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I answered in a flat tone. "Where the hell are you, Lucy?" The voice wasn't Jenna's. It was Mason's. He sounded erratic, breathing heavy, almost shouting. "I went into your room to get you for the notary, and you're not there. Your clothes are gone. Where is the folder with the papers?" I pulled the phone slightly away from my ear. I could hear raw panic vibrating in his vocal cords. His house of cards was collapsing. "I left early, Mason. I had errands to run," I replied with exasperating calm. "What errands?" "You're going to the nursing home today. The loan rep and the notary are arriving at the house in half an hour. I need you to sign the rights transfer papers immediately." "You are ruining my schedule, you stupid old woman. Get back to the house right now." In the background, I could hear my daughter's trembling voice. "Mason, please don't yell at her." "Mom, where are you? Come home. Let's talk." Jenna's plea sent a sharp pang through my chest, but I smothered it instantly. It was way too late for talking. "You told me last night that everything is speed, Mason," I said, pronouncing every single word with crystal clarity. "That everything is risk. You told me I was stuck in the last century. I am simply following your advice. I'm moving fast." "What the hell are you talking about?" he roared, entirely losing his grip. "If you don't come back and sign those papers, I swear to God I will hunt you down and drag you to that asylum myself. You're senile. You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I am doing. I am solving the problem of the house that is way too big for me. Wait for me there. I'll see you soon." I hung up before he could respond. I powered off the phone and set it on the table. Ellis, who had heard the shouting bleeding through the earpiece, was looking at me with a mix of awe and deep respect. "That man is desperate," Ellis noted, shaking his head. "If he has the lender's notary heading to your house right now, it's because he expected to have you cornered, terrified, and ready to sign without reading. But I'm not there, and neither are the papers." Ellis jumped up from his chair, suddenly injected with a youthful surge of energy. "I'm calling Dr. Elena Vargas my go-to attorney. She's ruthless. I'm going to have her come down here immediately. We are going to draft an absolute mandate of sale in my name and an immediate eviction notice for attempted fraud and financial abuse. If he already called a crooked notary to your house, we're going to show up with the law in our hands and the rightful owner." I nodded, and he grabbed the phone off his desk. While he spoke rapidly to the lawyer, I stood up and walked over to the front window of the agency. The city was fully awake now. Cars sped by. People hurried to work, blissfully unaware of the silent war being waged inside that office. I thought about the beef stew I had left on the table last night. I thought about Mason's ironed shirts. I thought about Jenna's complicit silence. I had spent 3 years acting as the invisible maid in my own home, allowing them to treat me like a piece of junk furniture about to be thrown out on the curb. Attorney Elena Vargas arrived 15 minutes later. She was a woman in her 50s, wearing an immaculate tailored suit and carrying a black leather briefcase. She blew in like a gust of highly efficient wind. Ellis quickly introduced us and gave her the rundown, pointing to the digital trail of the attempted fraud on his screen. The lawyer reviewed my deeds with a critical eye. "Flawless," she declared, snapping the folder shut. "Miss Lucy, what your son-in-law attempted to do is a severe felony. But stepping away from the criminal aspect, strictly from a civil standpoint, he is nothing more than a precarious occupant on your property. He holds no lease, he has no squatter's rights, and with this documented attempt at fraud, he forfeits any expectation of common courtesy. I want to sell the property to the Arango Group today, counselor, and I want Mason and his family out of the house before noon." Dr. Vargas nodded, pulled out her laptop, and started drafting the documents at breakneck speed. "We are going to sign an irrevocable promise of sale with the developer. Ellis will make sure Arango's rep is standing by. Simultaneously, we will sign an extrajudicial eviction order. Since the property is being transferred for commercial use and there is hard evidence of attempted asset theft, the law allows us to demand immediate vacating of the premises. If he resists, we call law enforcement with the order in hand." I signed every single document Dr. Vargas slid across the desk. My pulse was that of a surgeon. My hand didn't tremble for a fraction of a second. With every stroke of my pen, I dismantled Mason's castle of lies. With every signature, I hit him back with equal force. But, backed by the crushing weight of the legal system he held in such contempt. When we finished, Ellis took the documents and secured them in his briefcase. Then he walked over to a supply closet at the back of the office, opened it, and pulled out a large corrugated plastic sign. It featured bright red letters printed on a stark white background. "Commercial property for sale." Ellis looked at me and grinned. "Mason said he needed to host important clients at the house today, right?" Ellis asked, snapping his suspenders. "That's what he said, to inject capital into his project." "Well, we're going to bring him the most important clients he's ever going to see in his miserable life," Ellis said, grabbing his car keys. "The new owners of the property." The three of us walked out of the office together. Dr. Vargas flanked my left, Ellis took my right, carrying the sign. The morning sun was high now, burning off the pre-dawn chill. We got into Ellis's car. The drive to my house would take under 10 minutes. I sat in the back seat, smoothing out the fabric of my dress. The machine was in motion. The gears were turning with lethal precision, and time, that precious resource Mason firmly believed he controlled, was about to run out on him completely. I squeezed my pocket watch in the palm of my hand, feeling its steady heartbeat, preparing myself to open the door to my own home for the very last time. The drive in Ellis's car took exactly 9 minutes and 40 seconds. I timed it by the constant vibration of my pocket watch resting against my skirt, marking the pulse of a morning that no longer belonged to the realm of routine, but to the realm of dissection. Through the window, I watched the streets of my neighborhood glide by at a moderate speed. I knew every crack in the sidewalks, every tree whose roots had buckled the concrete over the decades. These were streets built by people who understood the value of a solid foundation of slow, quiet labor. The exact opposite of my son-in-law's papier-mâché philosophy. In the passenger seat, Dr. Elena Vargas was reviewing the documents we had just printed. The sound of the pages turning was crisp, dry, highly professional. I hadn't exchanged many words with her since we left the agency, but I didn't need to. I recognize people who operate on my exact frequency, devoid of drama, anchored to the facts, calibrated to function perfectly under pressure. Ellis drove with both hands gripping the wheel, his jaw tight, projecting a fierce indignation that I had personally chosen to box away. He felt the insult as if it were his own. After all, he had been standing right there when Arthur and I signed the papers for that empty dirt lot that would eventually become my home. As we turned the corner onto my street, I saw it, parked right in front of my driveway, hogging the curb with sloppy arrogance. A black sedan, late model, but coated in a thin layer of grime. It wasn't Mason's car. His vehicle had been repossessed a year ago. It was the getaway car for the scam. "That must be the lender's notary," Ellis muttered, stopping his car a few yards back under the shade of the massive oak tree lining the sidewalk. "They're early. Con artists are always punctual when they smell blood," Attorney Vargas replied, slipping the papers back into her black leather briefcase and snapping the metal clasp shut with a click that sounded like a gavel drop. "Miss Lucy, I remind you of our strategy. You do not engage in debate. You are the rightful owner, exercising your legal right. I am your legal voice. Ellis is the witness and the broker. Do not let them provoke you." "Don't worry, counselor," I said, pulling the door handle. "They lost the power to provoke me a long time ago." I stepped out of the vehicle. The morning air still held a biting edge. I walked up to the wrought iron front gate, the exact same one Arthur used to paint every other summer. Behind me, I heard the firm clicks of the lawyer's heels and the sound of Ellis's trunk popping open so he could grab the corrugated plastic sign. I didn't stop to wait for them. I pulled my key from my purse, slid it into the outer gate's lock, and opened it without making a sound. The front lawn was exactly as I'd left it, the rose bushes pruned, the grass still damp with morning dew. I walked up the 3 porch steps. I could hear voices spilling out from the dining room. Mason's voice, loud projected, using that tone of fake camaraderie he reserved exclusively for people he planned to exploit. He was talking about projections cash flow, a brilliant future built entirely on thin air. I slid the main key into the heavy solid wood door. The mechanism turned as smoothly as it always did. I pushed the door open. The foyer welcomed me with the familiar smell of floor wax and freshly brewed coffee. At the end of the hall in the dining room, the scene was arranged like a terribly painted portrait. Mason was standing up, pouring coffee into my fine china cups, wearing a gray suit that was a size too tight. Sitting at the head of my oak table, occupying the seat that used to belong to Arthur, was a man in his 50s. He looked sweaty despite the cold, wearing a cheap suit with an open briefcase next to him, overflowing with thick stacks of paper. And in the corner, shrunk into a chair by the display cabinet, sat Jenna. She was gripping a mug with both hands, staring down into the dark liquid, as if she could find a fire exit hidden inside it. The sound of my footsteps on the hardwood made all 3 of them snap their heads up in unison. Mason's smile froze instantly. The glass coffee pot hovered in mid-air for a second before he slammed it down onto the table, splashing dark drops across the embroidered tablecloth. "Finally, you show up," he barked, taking 2 aggressive steps toward me, puffing out his chest to reclaim his fake authority. "I thought you got lost wandering the street, Lucy. I told you not to leave. Mr. Morales has been waiting for you for 20 minutes. The man sitting at the table adjusted his glasses and shot me a condescending smile. The exact kind of smile people reserve for toddlers or for seniors they assume are mentally checked out. "Good morning, Miss Lucy." Mr. Morales said with a greasy, practiced voice.
Your son-in-law mentioned you went out for your morning stroll. It's good to walk. Gets the blood flowing. Come sit right here next to me. We just need a couple of tiny signatures to tidy up the house stuff, and then you can head off to your new home in peace. We have everything ready for your transfer.
I didn't answer right away. My gaze traveled from the fake notary's sweaty face down to the table. There, spread across the linen, were 3 stacks of documents. Even though I was several feet away, my eyes trained over decades to read the microscopic engravings on Swiss watch dials caught the bold headers. Broad power of attorney, transfer of property rights, and, peeking out from under a staple, a document bearing the letterhead of a private clinic I had never set foot in. Cognitive Evaluation Certificate. I felt an absolute, utter stillness descend over me. It was the exact same hyperfocus I experienced whenever I finally isolated a defective gear inside a highly complex machine. The forged medical certificate was the smoking gun. They had bribed a doctor to declare me legally incompetent. Jenna, my own flesh and blood, had agreed to sign a paper branding me insane, just so she wouldn't have to face her husband's rage and failure. I looked at Jenna. She looked up for a microsecond, her eyes bloodshot with a cocktail of guilt and sheer terror, and immediately pinned her gaze back down into her mug. In that fleeting instant, my mind snapped back in time with the brutal force of a released mainspring. I saw her at 10 years old. She had sneaked into my workshop without permission, looking for scissors, and in her childish clumsiness, she had knocked a 19th century French carriage clock I was restoring off the bench. The glass shattered into 100 pieces. The enamel dial cracked down the middle. Instead of telling me, Jenna swept up the glass, hid the clock behind some boxes, and pretended nothing had happened. I spent 3 frantic days looking for the piece, sick with anxiety over losing an antique that didn't even belong to me. When I finally found it and confronted her, she didn't cry out of remorse, she cried because she had been caught. She clung to Arthur's legs, crying that it was the wind, that it was the cat, anything but owning up to what she did. That night, Arthur sat on the edge of her bed and told her something I never forgot. The glass protects the hands, Jenna. If you break the glass and hide it, the dust gets inside the machine. Without the truth, the hands stop turning and the clock dies. The lie always destroys the mechanism from the inside. She nodded that night, but she never actually learned the lesson. She grew up dodging consequences, constantly searching for a shield to protect her from reality. And that shield ended up being Mason, a man built entirely out of lies, a machine packed with dust and broken gears. My love for her hadn't vanished, but in that precise moment, I finally understood that a mother's love cannot fix a clock that the daughter insists on smashing with a hammer. I accepted the fracture. I locked the door on my compassion, leaving nothing but the cold, surgical precision of justice. I am not going to sit down, Mr. Morales, I said, my voice ringing clear and steady in the acoustics of the dining room. And I am not going to sign a damn thing. Mason let out a dry, heavily forced laugh. Lucy, please don't start with your episodes again. We talked about this last night. You are no longer in any condition to make decisions. He turned to the notary with a look of simulated apology. I warned you, sir. Some days she wakes up completely lucid, and other days the senile dementia. That was the exact moment the front door, which I had left cracked open, swung wide. Attorney Elena Vargas marched into the dining room, followed closely by Ellis. The sharp clack of Dr. Vargas's heels against the hardwood floor echoed like a judge's gavel. Mason's smug smile vanished instantly. His eyes darted from the lawyer in the tailored suit to Ellis's familiar face. What the hell is this? Mason demanded, his voice losing a chunk of its volume.
What is this man doing in my house? And who are you?
Dr. Vargas didn't stop until she hit the edge of the oak table. She dropped her black leather briefcase flat onto the surface, right next to Mr. Morales's fraudulent paperwork. She did it with deliberate, heavy slowness, physically reclaiming the space. "Good morning," the lawyer stated, in a tone that crushed any room for debate. "I am Dr. Elena Vargas, legal counsel for Miss Lucy. And this is not your house, Mason. This is the exclusive property of my client, in which you are nothing more than a squatter with zero legal standing." Mr. Morales shifted in his chair, suddenly sweating a lot more. The moisture on his forehead seemed to multiply in seconds. He looked at Dr. Vargas, then down at the papers on the table, and subtly began sliding them toward his side of the table. "This is a private family matter, counselor." Mason tried to interject, taking a step forward, trying to use his physical height to intimidate her. "My mother-in-law has a medical diagnosis. She is not in full control of her mental faculties. We, as her family, are simply looking out for her financial well-being. I strongly suggest you leave before I call the police for trespassing." Dr. Vargas didn't even blink. She snapped her briefcase open and pulled out a blue folder. "Please call the police," Vargas replied, extending her hand toward the landline resting on the side table. "It would save us the trip down to the precinct to file criminal charges for attempted fraud, forgery of medical documents, and attempted asset theft against a senior citizen. Felonies which, by the way, carry mandatory prison time without bail in this state." Silence crashed down on the dining room with the weight of a lead slab. The ticking of the wall clock, my perfectly calibrated pendulum clock, became the only sound left in the room. Attorney Vargas then shifted her icy gaze to the man sitting at the table. "Mr. Morales, I presume," she said, reading the name off the folder the man was actively trying to hide. "I know every single registered notary in this district, and your face isn't ringing any bells. Which leads me to deduce you are a runner for some third-tier loan shark operating entirely outside your jurisdiction and facilitating coerced signatures. Am I wrong?" Morales swallowed so hard his Adam's apple looked like it was trying to escape his throat. He knew he was trapped. In the ecosystem of low-level con artists, the golden rule is the survival of the biggest coward. When the lights flip on, the roaches scatter. I was just hired to notarize some mutual signatures," Morales stammered, scrambling to his feet, shoving his documents into his briefcase with shaking hands. "I was assured that the property owner was in full agreement and that the medical certificate was 100% legitimate. If there's a conflict of interest or a pending legal dispute, I am out of here immediately. My firm does not participate in litigation of this nature." "Morales, sit your ass down!" Mason screamed, the raw panic finally bleeding right through his facade of control. "You're not going anywhere. We have a deal. The loan is already pre-approved." "The loan is canceled, sir," Morales shot back, snapping his briefcase shut. "Sort out your family drama. Excuse me." Morales didn't even make eye contact with me as he squeezed past. He speed-walked down the hallway and bolted out the front door, leaving it wide open. Seconds later, we heard the engine of his black sedan gun it, tires squealing against the asphalt. Mason's house of cards had completely vaporized in under 3 minutes. I watched him struggle to breathe, his fists balled tight at his sides. His brain, so accustomed to twisting reality to fit his narrative, was short-circuiting as it slammed into an immovable object. He whipped around to face me, his face flushed deep red, the veins in his neck bulging against his collar. "You did this," he roared, shedding every last trace of that fake respect he wore like a mask. "You selfish old bitch. You ruined my only shot at saving this family. Without that cash, we're going to lose everything. I was going to multiply that capital. I was going to give us a real life, not this garbage old neighborhood misery. No, Mason, I cut in, taking one step toward him. My voice was low, but sharp as a razor. You weren't going to save anyone. You were going to plug the holes of your own sheer incompetence using the bricks of my house. You were going to steal the only secure asset your wife and son have to their name, just so you could keep playing pretend as a successful CEO. You are a broken mechanism, and I do not allow defective parts on my property. Jenna sobbed from her corner. It was a high-pitched, pitiful sound. Mom, please, she begged, finally standing up from the chair, hands clasped tightly against her chest. Try to understand. We were desperate. Mason swore to me the business was going to take off this time, that the nursing home would only be for a few months until we bought a brand new condo with the profits. You don't understand business, Mom. Everything is a risk. I looked at her. I really looked at her, searching for some trace of the grown woman she was supposed to be. And all I found was the terrified 10-year-old girl hiding the broken glass. You take risks with your own money, Jenna, I replied, my expression dead flat. When you take a risk with someone else's money behind their back and through fraud, it's not called business. It's called theft. And the fact that you were entirely willing to lock me up in a charity ward just to fund his delusions is a bill I refuse to pay. Mason, making one last desperate lunge to regain control through sheer physical aggression, slammed both fists onto the table, making the china cups jump. Well, we are not leaving, he roared, spit flying from his lips. Let's see you try and drag us out. We've been living here for 3 years. The law protects us. I don't give a damn what your bargain bin lawyer says. I'm not moving an inch until I get my cut. That was when Ellis, who had been standing quietly taking in the whole dynamic, stepped up to the table. He had the large corrugated plastic sign tucked under his arm. He unrolled it in one fluid motion and stood it upright right on top of the oak table, leaning it against the center vase. The bright, glossy red letters caught the morning light. High-density commercial property for sale. Arango Group. Mason stared at the sign. His eyes narrowed, struggling to process the words. His brain got completely snagged on the word commercial. Like I was saying, Mason, Ellis chimed in, adjusting his suspenders with crushing nonchalance. You talk a big game about business, but it seems you don't do your homework. The city council changed the zoning for this block 8 months ago. Your mother-in-law isn't sitting on an old house. She's sitting on a prime piece of commercial real estate. The Arango Group, the biggest developer in the city, has spent the last half year trying to buy this exact corner to build a boutique plaza. Mason's jaw dropped slightly. The flushed crimson of his rage was rapidly draining away, replaced by a sickly, pale dread. He was doing the math. I could literally see the numbers spinning in his pupils. Commercial. Mason muttered, his arrogance deflating like a punctured tire. How much is this lot worth? About $3 million above the residential appraisal you were trying to use for your little scam with the loan shark. Ellis answered without an ounce of mercy. Cold, hard cash. No mortgages. No shady third-party brokers. Miss Lucy signed the irrevocable promise of sale in my office exactly 40 minutes ago. The house is already sold. The sheer impact of the revelation hit Mason with the physical force of a freight train. He stumbled backward, slightly bumping into the credenza. The man who bragged endlessly about his corporate vision. The man who called me a burden and tried to ship me to an asylum because I didn't understand the modern world, had just realized he had tried to pawn off a commercial gold mine for a handful of dirty pennies, strictly due to his own absolute ignorance and his utter contempt for the world right outside his window. Jenna pressed both hands against her face, letting out a muffled groan. She understood the magnitude of the mathematical error, too. Dr. Vargas seized their absolute paralysis to deliver the final blow. She pulled a document stamped with official red seals from her blue folder and slid it across the table, stopping it right in front of Mason. This is an extraordinary eviction notice due to immediate commercial transfer, fully backed by the criminal complaint for attempted fraud that is already processing in the judicial system, the lawyer explained with clinical detachment. Since there is no formal lease and because this is a corporate commercial sale, the new owners, the Arango Group, require physical delivery of the vacant premises today. Mason looked up from the paper, eyes wide with horror, searching for my gaze in a pathetic attempt to appeal to the very mercy he had slaughtered the night before. "Today," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You can't do this to us, Lucy. We have nowhere to go. We don't have the money for a move today. We have Finn. He's your grandson." He brought up Finn. He used the boy as a human shield exactly the way I knew he would, but I had already calibrated that piece in my head. "Finn will not suffer," I said, keeping my posture rigid, refusing to step any closer to him. I already made the necessary arrangements to pay his school tuition for the rest of the year, and I left an envelope in Jenna's name at the notary with enough funds to rent a modest apartment for 6 months. Enough so you won't be sleeping on the street. But not a single penny of that money will ever touch your hands, Mason. The rent will be paid directly to the landlord. I took one step forward. The distance between us was minimal now. I looked at him from the height of my 73 years, feeling the heavy weight of every minute of every hour I had poured into building the home he had tried to rip away from me. "Last night, you gave me an order, Mason," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room. "You threw a brochure in my face and told me to pack my bags because I was leaving this house first thing in the morning." I raised my right hand and pointed toward the open hallway door where the clear morning sky was visible. "Now I am returning the brochure. You have until noon. At exactly 12 o'clock, the Arango Group's demolition crew and the police will be standing at that door. Pack your bags. Today, you are going to that place." The pendulum clock behind me chimed 9 times. The deep, metallic gong echoed through the dining room, triggering the countdown. 3 hours. 180 minutes. The exact amount of time left for Mason's mirage before the grinding gears of reality chewed him up entirely. I turned around, feeling the familiar creak of the third step under my feet, and walked out onto the porch, letting the freezing air cleanse my lungs while I listened to the unmistakable sound of absolute panic erupting right behind me. The cold morning air hit my face the second I crossed the threshold onto the porch, flushing the heavy, stale atmosphere of the dining room from my lungs. Behind me, the heavy oak door clicked shut with a sense of finality, but it couldn't completely drown out the chaos I had just unleashed inside. I heard the dull thud of a chair hitting the floor, followed by the muffled echoes of Mason screaming. His voice, entirely stripped of that fake veneer of elegance he practiced in the mirror, was now high-pitched, broken, barking, nonsensical orders at a woman who had no idea how to follow them. Dr. Elena Vargas stepped out right behind me, snapping her black leather briefcase shut with a metallic clack that sounded exactly like a judge's gavel coming down. She popped her coat collar and checked her wristwatch. 9:05, the lawyer stated, her voice devoid of any agitation. "The timeline is active. I just texted the legal rep for the Arango Group. The eviction crew and the developer's site inspector will arrive at exactly 11:45 to do the final walkthrough before taking physical possession. Ellis walked down the porch steps and rubbed his hands together to fight the chill. His face, usually the picture of calm, displayed a mix of deep satisfaction and coiled tension. That bastard really thought he could trample 40 years of neighborhood history with a forged piece of paper. Ellis muttered, glaring at the dining room window, where Mason's silhouette was pacing frantically back and forth. "Lucy, are you absolutely sure you want to stay here for the next 3 hours? I can take you back to my office or to the hotel. You don't need a front row seat to the circus that man is about to put on." I shook my head slowly, gripping the handle of my purse. "No, Ellis. A watchmaker doesn't walk away from the bench until the last broken piece has been extracted and the mechanism is clean. I need to pack up the rest of my tools. My workshop has a separate entrance through the backyard. I don't have to cross paths with them in the hallway. I'll be in my car, parked right out front." Ellis pointed to his vehicle idling by the curb. "Dr. Vargas has to head down to the courthouse to formally file the fraud complaint, but I am not leaving this street until those two are out on the sidewalk with their bags. If I hear one scream out of line, I'm walking in there with the cops." I thanked them both with a slight nod. Attorney Vargas shook my hand firmly, promising to return before noon, and walked down toward the main avenue to hail a cab. I walked down the steps and followed the gravel path that wrapped around the side of the house. The sound of my shoes crunching against the gray stones felt immensely familiar. I knew the exact location of every rosebush, of every vine crawling up the brick wall. I walked past the kitchen window and could hear water gushing from the faucet. Someone had left the tap running in the middle of their panic. I reached the backyard. The lemon trees Arthur and I had planted were heavy with fruit, totally indifferent to the destruction of the home that gave them shade. I pulled the brass key from my pocket and unlocked the weathered wooden door that led directly into my workshop. The interior greeted me with its signature scent of polished brass, synthetic precision oil, and aged wood. I flipped on the cold light lamp hanging over my workbench. Everything was exactly as I had left it yesterday afternoon, right before the nursing home brochure stained my table and my life. The titanium tweezers lined up by size, the millimeter screwdrivers in their rotating stand, the tiny vials of Swiss lubricant meticulously organized. I walked over to the back cabinet and pulled out a mahogany box lined with green velvet, the one I used to transport the most delicate mechanisms. I began packing with slow automatic movements. First the calipers, then the loops. Then the tiny spare gears I kept in glass vials. As I was wrapping the bell of a pocket watch in tissue paper, the wall separating my shop from the interior hallway vibrated slightly. Pick up the damn phone." Mason's voice bled through the drywall, muffled but perfectly intelligible. "Julio, it's Mason. Listen to me. I need that bridge loan we talked about. Yes, today. Right now." "What do you mean, no? I told you the house was the collateral. Don't hang up on me, Julio." "Julio?" The sound of a phone violently smashing against the wall made my hands stop moving for a fraction of a second. The great business strategist, the man who considered me a burden for living in the past century, was rapidly discovering the extreme fragility of his web of lies. His so-called investors were nothing more than vultures, waiting to feed on the roadkill he promised to drag in. Once the house vanished from the equation, Mason was nothing, a hollow shell. I kept packing. I nested my precision oilers into the compartments of the mahogany box. At 10:15, the interior door of my shop, the one connecting to the main house, burst open. Mason appeared in the doorway. He looked absolutely pathetic. His gray tie hung loose and unraveled around his neck. His shirt was soaked with sweat at the armpits. His hair was a mess. He was mouth-breathing heavily, like a cornered animal, searching for an exit that didn't exist. He gripped a half-zipped canvas duffel bag in one hand. I didn't look up. I grabbed a pair of tweezers, picked up a microscopic screw off the mat, and dropped it into a test tube. You can't do this to us," Mason panted, taking 2 steps into the workshop, his voice stripped of its deafening arrogance, reduced now to a desperate hiss. "You can't throw us out on the street. It's illegal. I'm going to sue you. I'm going to take you to court and prove you're senile, that the sale was a fraud." I finished twisting the cap onto the test tube, slotted it into its designated groove inside the box, and finally turned my head to look at him. "To take someone to court, Mason, you need money to pay a lawyer," I replied, keeping my volume as low and steady as the ticking of a clock. "And you just blew your very last pennies paying off that fake notary who literally ran out my front door. Furthermore, the property transfer is already registered and sealed by the developer. You have absolutely nothing to fight with." He dropped the canvas bag. It hit the floor with a dull thud, revealing that he had just shoved a bunch of wrinkled suits and designer shoes he hadn't even finished paying off inside. "I am your daughter's husband," he screamed, slapping the doorframe with an open palm, trying to rely on physical intimidation now that his legal threats had turned to dust. "I am your grandson's father. If you throw us out today, I swear on my life, I will take Finn to another city. You will never see him again. I will erase you from his life." I picked up a microfiber cloth and began carefully polishing the glass of my main loop. I didn't let his threat spike my heart rate. I had anticipated that exact move since 4 in the morning. "Finn is the only reason you aren't sleeping in a city shelter tonight," I said, rubbing the glass in tiny circles. "Like I told you an hour ago, Dr. Vargas has an envelope waiting for Jenna at her firm. It contains 6 months' rent paid up front for an apartment right near the boys' school. But that lease comes with a very specific clause, dictated personally by me." Mason frowned, his erratic breathing pausing as his brain scrambled to process the information. "If you attempt to move Finn out of this city, or if you deny me the visitation rights outlined in that exact same document, the funds freeze immediately, and the lease is voided." I held the loop up to the light to check for smudges. "You will be chained to that working-class apartment, surviving on the charity of the very woman you tried to lock up in an asylum, until you get a real job to support yourself. You are not in control here, Mason. You lost control the exact second you threw that brochure on my table." My son-in-law's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He took another step forward, raising an accusing finger, physically shaking with impotence. "You are a monster," he spat, his eyes bloodshot. "A bitter, calculating old bitch." "I am a watchmaker," I corrected him, closing the lid of the mahogany box and securing the brass latches. "I fix what can be fixed, and I throw out the rotting parts that threaten to destroy the entire system. You are a rotting part, Mason. And right now, you are a burden in my workshop. Go pack. You have less than 2 hours." He stood rooted to the spot for a long minute, searching my face for any flicker of doubt, any hairline crack of sympathy he could crawl through to manipulate me again. He found nothing. Just the polished, bulletproof surface of a final decision. Finally, he let out a guttural grunt, snatched his bag off the floor, and stormed out of the shop, slamming the door so hard the glass vials rattled. The silence returned to the room, but it was a temporary silence. I stacked my boxes near the back door, ready to be loaded into a cab when the time came. I sat on my stool and looked out the window at the patio. The sun had started baking the terracotta tiles. At 11:15, the interior door opened again, this time with agonizing slowness. It was Jenna, She was wearing an oversized wool coat, clutching a cardboard box full of photo albums and Finn's toys to her chest. Her face was swollen from crying, her eyes bloodshot mascara smeared down her cheeks. She looked like she had aged 10 years in the last 2 hours. She hovered in the doorway, terrified to actually step onto the floorboards of the workshop, as if she knew she was no longer welcome in my sacred spaces. "Mom," she whispered, her voice shattering on the vowel. I stood up from the stool and crossed my arms, maintaining my distance. I didn't walk toward her. I didn't offer her the comfort she was so desperately looking for. "Did you pack the boys' things, Jenna?" I asked in a strictly practical tone. She nodded frantically, tears spilling over again and dripping onto the edge of the cardboard box. "Yes, I'm almost done." Finn is terrified in his room. Mason screamed at him to pack his books. "Mom, please, where are we supposed to go? Mason says the envelope you talked about is a lie, just a trap to humiliate him." "The envelope is at notary number 4 on the Central Avenue, waiting for your signature," I replied. "It's real. But I am warning you right now, Jenna. The money is in your name. The lease will be in your name. If you hand over control of that apartment to your husband, you will lose everything in under a month." Jenna squeezed the box against her chest until her knuckles turned white. She stared down at the wooden floorboards, completely incapable of holding the weight of my words. "He promised me everything was going to change," she sobbed, her voice reduced to a childish whimper. "He told me if you signed the mortgage, we were going to be rich, that I wouldn't have to work double shifts anymore. I just wanted to stop being so tired, Mom. I just wanted my family to work." "Your family worked because I was the one holding it up," I fired back, feeling the ice in my voice crack slightly from the sheer weight of disappointment. "I cooked, I ironed, I shut off the lights and the water, while you closed your eyes to the staggering incompetence of the man you chose. And when he decided my very existence was an obstacle to his fantasies, you put your head down and agreed to throw me in the trash. I was scared." Jenna cried out, throwing her head back, her desperation finally shattering her habitual silence. "You don't know how he gets when things don't go his way. You have ice in your veins, Mom. You calculate everything. You measure everything. I'm not strong like you. Forgive me. Please. Please forgive me." The echo of her plea bounced off the walls, lined with tools. I watched her tremble, clinging to her memories in that cardboard box. And for a fraction of a second, the maternal instinct to protect threatened to cloud my judgment. But then, I remembered the glossy brochure. I remembered the word burden. I remembered her complicit silence last night at the dinner table. "Forgiveness is a feeling. Jenna and I forgive you because you are my daughter," I said, measuring every word with surgical precision. "But trust is a structure, and you completely demolished that structure. You can have my forgiveness, but you no longer have my house or my protection. It is time for you to be an adult and face the consequences of the man you handed the steering wheel of your life to. And I promise you one thing. The second Mason realizes there's no more easy money and no more free roof, he will blame this entire failure on you. Get ready for that." Jenna choked back a scream, squeezed her eyes shut, and backed out into the hallway. She didn't argue anymore. She knew that every single word I just spoke was an absolute truth she had spent years trying to ignore. She turned around and vanished into the shadows of the house, taking the last remaining scraps of the family we used to be with her. At 11:30 in the morning, I walked out of the workshop through the patio door, carrying my 2 mahogany boxes and my small leather suitcase. I followed the gravel path around to the front sidewalk. The midday sun was fully baking the street now, lighting up the scene with unforgiving clarity. The spectacle on the sidewalk was downright pathetic. Mason and Jenna were dragging their belongings out through the front door. There was no moving truck. Mason didn't have the credit or the cash to hire one. They were piling black trash bags stuffed with clothes, poorly taped cardboard boxes, and cheap suitcases directly onto the concrete sidewalk right under the massive oak tree. Finn, my grandson, was sitting on top of one of the suitcases, clutching his blue backpack, staring off into space with a look of total bewilderment that broke my heart. I gave him a tiny wave from a distance. He saw me and lowered his head, deeply ashamed of a situation he had zero blame for. The neighborhood, that community network Mason despised for being so small town, hadn't taken long to notice the commotion. The curtains in the adjacent houses were twitching subtly. Agnes, the bakery owner, had come out to sweep the sidewalk in front of her shop down at the corner, even though there wasn't a single leaf to sweep. She just stood there, leaning on her broom, watching the downfall of the man who owed her 2 months of breakfasts. Sam, the hotel clerk, was walking by with a couple of grocery bags. He stopped dead in his tracks right next to Ellis's parked car, crossing his arms to watch the finale. Mason stumbled out the front door carrying a clear plastic storage tub, the kind used to archive files. He was sweating heavily, his face beet red from the physical exertion, and the sheer humiliation of feeling the neighborhood's eyes burning into him. "Don't just stand there staring, you bunch of gossips!" Mason screamed, entirely losing his mind when he spotted Agnes and Sam. "Mind your own damn business!" In his blind rage, Mason stepped wrong on the edge of the porch stairs. His ankle rolled slightly. He lost his balance and he had to drop the plastic tub to stop himself from face-planting into the concrete. The tub slammed into the sidewalk and cracked right down the middle with a sharp snap. The contents spilled out across the pavement, caught by the freezing midday breeze. They weren't million-dollar contracts or investment portfolios like he always bragged about. They were dozens of red-stamped collection notices, maxed-out credit card bills, pawn shop receipts, and flyers for predatory payday loans. One of the papers blew all the way down the block, landing right at Agnes's feet. The baker looked down at it, looked up at Mason, and let out a dry, entirely humorless laugh. "Well, look at that, Mr. Mason," Agnes yelled from the corner, her voice carrying down the entire block. "Looks like your foreign investors are sending you nothing but past-due bills. Let's see if you can pay me for the cheese bread you ate for free with those." Mason's face went from red to deep purple. He dropped to the sidewalk, crawling pathetically on his hands and knees, trying to snatch the papers the wind was scattering, desperately trying to hide the hard evidence of his financial misery from the exact same people he had treated like dirt. Jenna ran out of the house and tried to help him, but he slapped her hand away violently. "Leave it alone!" he screamed at his wife, his fists full of crumpled paper. "This is all your crazy mother's fault." Ellis, who had been watching the scene unfold from the hood of his parked car, stood up straight, adjusted his suspenders, and took a few steps toward the mountain of trash and luggage blocking the sidewalk.
"Mr. Mason!"
Ellis called out, projecting his voice with the authority of a man who had spent his entire life walking those streets. "I highly suggest you pick up your trash quickly. Your bags are currently a burden on the public right-of-way. And as you so eloquently pointed out last night, everything in this modern world is about speed." Mason froze. The word burden, the exact same word he had used to try and toss me into an asylum, flew back and hit him like a lead boomerang right in the center of his fragile ego. He looked at Ellis, looked at the neighbors whispering among themselves, and finally, he looked at me, standing perfectly still by the gravel path. My tools flawlessly packed, my coat buttoned up tight. The symmetry of the humiliation was absolute. The man who thought he owned the chessboard was now crawling on the sidewalk, surrounded by his own lies, fully exposed before the jury of the street. I hoisted my purse onto my shoulder. It was exactly 11:45. A deep, rhythmic, heavy rumble started vibrating through the pavement, rolling in from the main avenue. The distinct growl of heavy diesel engines. I turned my head toward the corner. A massive flatbed truck, painted bright yellow, with the black Arango Group logo stamped on the side, turned slowly onto our street. Trailing right behind the rig was a white crew cab pickup truck. 3 men hopped out wearing hard hats, reflective vests, and carrying clipboards loaded with blueprints. Right next to them, Dr. Elena Vargas walked with a brisk, purposeful stride, pointing directly at the facade of the house. The convoy parked right in front of the property, completely blocking the view from the street. The truck's engine roared one last time before shutting off, leaving a sudden, suffocating silence hanging in the air. The crew foreman, a tall man with broad shoulders, stared at the mountain of black bags and luggage on the sidewalk. Then he looked down at Mason, who was still on his knees, clutching his bills, and finally checked the blueprint in his hand. The hour had arrived. The clock had struck 12, and the pendulum of consequences was about to bulldoze the final remnants of the fantasy my son-in-law had tried to bury me in. The demolition crew foreman stepped out of the white pickup with the heavy gait of a man who has spent decades wrestling with concrete and steel. He wore scuffed work boots, a deeply scratched yellow hard hat, and carried a clipboard clamped with rolled-up blueprints. Behind him, the other 3 workers started dragging bright orange metal barricades off the flatbed, tossing them onto the asphalt with a metallic crash that sent a flock of birds scattering from the branches of the old oak tree. The sound of steel hitting concrete was the first real nail in the coffin of my son-in-law's delusions. Mason, still on his knees on the sidewalk, pathetically trying to scrape up his past-due bills and foreclosure threats, jerked his head up. His face was streaked with sweat and grime. Seeing the men in reflective vests and the massive rig blocking the street, he scrambled to get to his feet, but his rolled ankle gave out, forcing him to lean awkwardly against the trunk of the tree. Dr. Elena Vargas marched up to the foreman, pulling the sealed folder we had just signed at the notary out of her black leather briefcase. "Good morning. I am the legal representative for the seller, and here are the official copies of the extrajudicial eviction order and the transfer of deed," the lawyer stated, handing the paperwork to the man. "The property is legally vacant and ready for the Arango Group to take possession. However, as you can see, the former occupants have left personal debris, blocking the public right-of-way." The foreman took the documents, scanned them with a quick, expert eye, and then shifted his gaze to the mountain of black trash bags, cheap luggage, and poorly taped cardboard boxes clogging the entrance. Finally, his eyes locked on to Mason, who was staring back with wide, panicked eyes, struggling to breathe, as if the oxygen in the street had suddenly turned to syrup. "Hey, buddy!" The foreman barked at Mason, using a gravelly voice that left zero room for debate or corporate pitch meetings. "I need you to clear this perimeter immediately. We're putting up the site fence and rolling heavy machinery through that gate. Anything left on this sidewalk in the next 10 minutes gets reclassified as garbage, and we're tossing it in the dumpster." Mason puffed out his chest in one final, desperate attempt to tap into the arrogance he had used to terrorize his wife for years. He adjusted the loosened knot of his stained tie and hobbled one step toward the foreman. "You can't threaten me!" Mason bellowed, spitting with every syllable, pointing a shaking finger at the rig. "I am a businessman. This is my house. There is pending litigation. If you touch a single piece of my luggage, I will sue every last one of you for property damage and theft." The foreman didn't even blink. He didn't argue. He didn't debate. Men who tear down buildings for a living don't waste time negotiating with the termites fleeing the rotting wood. He simply raised one hand, signaled to one of his guys, and unclipped a two-way radio from his belt. But he didn't even need to press the mic. In that exact second, the wail of a siren sliced through the street. A city police cruiser, requested in advance by Dr. Vargas as a preventative measure, turned the corner past Agnes's bakery and rolled slowly down the block, parking dead center behind the construction crew's pickup. The red and blue flashers pulsed rhythmically, throwing aggressive bursts of color across Jenna's pale, hollowed-out face as she stood next to the trash bags, gripping my grandson Finn's hand. Two police officers stepped out of the cruiser. They walked straight over to Dr. Vargas, who immediately flashed the judicial order with the raised red seals. The lead officer nodded, adjusted his tactical belt, and turned to face Mason. "Sir, the eviction order is crystal clear, and the property transfer is completely legal," the cop said, with lethal calm. "You have 5 minutes to remove your personal belongings from the public sidewalk and vacate the construction zone. If you cause a disturbance, interfere with these workers, or refuse to comply with a court order, I will personally arrest you for contempt and obstruction. Am I making myself clear?" The word arrest was the kill shot. Mason's engine of lies locked up with a deafening screech that only he could hear inside his own head. His shoulders slumped. The entire facade of the highly successful businessman, the high-stakes investor who needed a massive house to entertain clients, vaporized completely, exposing a pathetic, cornered man without a single dime to his name. He looked at the cops. He looked at the foreman, and then he whipped his head around to find his wife. "Jenna," Mason begged, his voice cracking, extending a trembling hand toward her. "Jenna, tell them something. Tell them they can't do this to us. Go find your mother. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her it was a mistake." But Jenna didn't look at him. For the very first time in 3 years, my daughter didn't lower her head to cover for him, nor did she run to patch up his emotional sinkholes. She kept her eyes glued to the asphalt. She squeezed little Finn's hand tighter, grabbed the strap of her canvas duffel bag, and started walking the opposite way down the avenue, leaving him behind. She didn't say a single word. Jenna's silence was the most brutal, profoundly justified sentence Mason could have ever received. While the workers started dragging the heavy orange barricades to fence off the perimeter of what used to be my home, a yellow taxi pulled up smoothly right next to me on the far end of the sidewalk. Ellis, who had been watching the entire finale from his car, walked over to help the driver load my 2 mahogany boxes and my leather suitcase into the trunk. "Everything played out exactly the way you calculated, Lucy," Ellis murmured, slamming the trunk shut with a solid thud. "Swiss precision, applied to poetic justice." "It's not poetry, Ellis. It's elementary physics," I replied, tightening my gray wool scarf around my neck to block the biting midday breeze. "Every action generates an equal reaction. He pushed the pendulum way too far, and the pendulum simply swung back with the exact same force." I said goodbye to Ellis with a firm, deeply sincere handshake, thanking him for his bulletproof loyalty, and gave Dr. Vargas a nod of gratitude from across the street. I opened the back door of the cab and slid onto the synthetic leather seat. The driver asked for my destination, and I gave him the address of a small commercial real estate office in the city's historic district, a place I had already been on the phone with since the early hours of the morning. Through the window, as the cab pulled away from the curb, I took one last look at the scene. The Arango Group's rig was already firing up its hydraulic engines. The orange barricades were completely blocking the view of the front porch and the lemon tree garden. And right there, locked outside the metal fence, sitting on a black trash bag on the edge of the curb, surrounded by his scattered debt notices with his head buried between his knees, sat the man who had called me a burden. I didn't feel sad. I felt no nostalgia for the bricks that were about to be pulverized. The house had run its course, and I, at 73 years old, was about to start mine with a freshly lubricated mechanism. Time, just like the gears of a perfectly built watch, doesn't stop to pity the people who try to break it. It just keeps ticking. And so, 7 months went by. Autumn brought a freezing wind that swept dry leaves down the cobblestone streets of the historic district, an old neighborhood where the buildings still featured high ceilings, plaster crown molding, and arched windows. It was right there on a prime corner, surrounded by quiet coffee shops and used bookstores, where I decided to set up my new life. With the payout from the commercial sale to the Arango Group, which turned out to be an amount obscene enough to guarantee the financial peace of 3 generations, I bought a spacious ground-floor storefront in a French-style building that included a fully gutted and remodeled apartment in the back. The front space became my sanctuary. Above the front door, a hand-carved oak sign with polished brass lettering read, Lucy's, Precision Horology and Restoration. The inside smelled of cedar wood, synthetic Mobius oil, and the aged paper of vintage calibration manuals. I had installed beveled glass display cases lined in dark green velvet, where I showcased the pieces I bought at auction, restored with infinite patience, and then sold to collectors who actually understood the value of reclaimed time. My daily routine had become an exercise in absolute freedom. I woke up at 6 in the morning, not to iron a parasite's shirts or to cook out of sheer obligation, but to brew myself a cup of coffee in my own black granite kitchen while listening to classical music on the radio. Nobody demanded silence. Nobody called me an old woman. Nobody told me the modern world was moving too fast for me. I was the absolute master of every single second ticked off by the 50 wall pendulum and mantel clocks decorating my shop, creating a symphony of overlapping ticks and tocks that would drive anyone else insane, but to me was the pure sound of peace. It was a Tuesday afternoon, right around 4 o'clock, when the brass bell above the door chimed, announcing company. I was sitting at my workbench using a precision lathe to polish the arbor of an antique balance wheel when I looked up through my magnifying loops. Ellis and Agnes walked into the shop, shaking off the drops from a fine drizzle that had just started falling over the city. Ellis was wearing his classic wool coat and immaculate suspenders, while Agnes held a white pastry box, radiating the unmistakable scent of baked butter and powdered sugar. "Lord, what a gorgeous place, Lucy!" Agnes exclaimed, snapping her umbrella shut and looking around with wide eyes, genuinely amazed by the surgical cleanliness and elegance of the shop. "Every time I come here, I feel like I'm walking into a museum in Europe. I mean, I've never been to Europe, but this is exactly how I picture it." I switched off the lathe, pulled off my loops, and stood up to greet them with a wide, genuine smile. Come in, come in! The kettle is already boiling for tea," I told them, guiding them toward a small, wrought iron table with a marble top that I kept tucked in the corner of the shop specifically for these impromptu visits. We sat around the table. Agnes opened the box to reveal a dozen freshly baked guava and cheese pastries, a gesture of affection she repeated every single time she came to see me. I poured the black tea into fine china cups, soaking in the heat radiating from the ceramic against my palms. "I took a drive past your old street this morning, Lucy," Ellis mentioned, taking a careful sip of his tea. The Arango group isn't messing around. They already finished the deep excavation, and they're pouring the footings for the steel columns. It's going to be a beautiful glass building. They completely erased any trace of the old house. It's for the best, I replied serenely, reaching for a pastry. New foundations require clean dirt. If you leave debris buried down there, the structure will eventually crack. Agnes dabbed the corners of her mouth with a paper napkin and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the marble table, slipping into that highly confidential posture of someone about to drop high-value intel on the neighborhood's underground economy. Speaking of debris, Lucy, guess who my grandson Sam saw last week down in the South Industrial Park? Agnes asked, lowering her voice dramatically, even though we were the only ones in the shop. I looked at her without changing my expression, waiting for her to put the puzzle together herself. Mason. Agnes continued dropping the name with a heavy mix of disgust and sheer triumph. Sam went down to a wholesale parts depot to grab stuff for his motorcycle, and he saw your ex-son-in-law working at a car wash on the exact same block. Sam said he almost didn't recognize him. He was wearing busted rubber boots, a plastic apron covered in grease and soap foam, and he was chamois drying the hood of a truck under the blazing midday sun. Ellis let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. The great international venture capitalist ended up buffing rims with cheap wax, the real estate agent noted, adjusting his glasses. Divine Justice has a remarkably sharp sense of humor, you have to admit. Oh, but that's not even the best part, Agnes added, waving her hand. Sam sneaked a little closer to listen in. Apparently, the guy is still clinging to his delusions of grandeur. He was telling the owner of the truck that he was actually a high-level financial advisor on a temporary spiritual retreat, and that he had lost a multi-million-dollar real estate deal because of a massive family conspiracy. The truck owner just tossed a few quarters out the window and told him to hurry up with the hubcaps. I listened to the report with the exact same neutrality I used to check the wear on a gear tooth. Mason's downfall wasn't divine punishment. It was the strict mathematical consequence of his own decisions. I already knew, thanks to Attorney Vargas, exactly how events had played out after the eviction. Mason, in his infinite stupidity, had attempted to forge Jenna's signature to cash out the 6 months of prepaid rent I had left at the notary. He wanted to pocket the cash to try and resuscitate his scams, but Dr. Vargas had left ironclad instructions. The landlord caught the attempted diversion of funds, triggered the cancellation clause I had drafted, and Mason was thrown out of the apartment in 3 days with zero right to appeal. That was the ultimate breaking point for my daughter Jenna. Finally exposed to the brutal elements without my house to absorb the impacts, and watching the man who was supposed to protect her try to steal the roof right over their son's head, she finally snapped out of her trance. She packed her bags. That very night, she changed the locks on the modest apartment she ended up renting on her own in a working-class neighborhood, and left Mason's suitcases out on the sidewalk in the freezing rain. Exactly what he had planned to do to me. "And Jenna?" Ellis asked, reading my thoughts with the sharp intuition of an old friend. "Does she still come by on Saturdays?" I nodded slowly, feeling a comforting warmth spread through my chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the tea. "Yes, Jenna and Finn come over every Saturday morning," I replied, looking out toward the front window where the rain was tracing lines down the glass. Jenna got a job as an administrative secretary at a dental clinic. She works hard, rides the bus for almost 2 hours a day, and she has dark circles under her eyes from actual physical exhaustion, not from sheer terror. She's lost weight, but her eyes don't have that shadow of constant panic anymore. She is learning to live with the truth, and the truth, while heavy, doesn't crush you the way lies do. "That boy is a total sweetheart," Agnes said, smiling brightly. Last time they came, he stopped by the bakery to buy you a cheese roll with his own allowance money. He told me he was helping you clean the watch crystals. He is. Finn has a natural patience about him. He sits on that little stool next to my bench and watches me take the movements apart. I'm teaching him how to tell flathead screws from bridge screws. He's young, but he has very steady hands. The conversation drifted toward lighter topics. We talked about Agnes's new pastry recipe, the real estate market fluctuations that Ellis loved to analyze, and the deep tranquility of living in the historic district. Their visit was a balm, a solid confirmation that the community network holding me up was completely intact, stronger and more present than ever, despite my change in zip code. An hour later, my friends said their goodbyes, stepping back out into the drizzle with promises to return next week. I locked the door behind them, flipped the sign to closed, and threw the brass deadbolt. The afternoon had darkened, wrapping the shop in a warm, cozy twilight, lit only by the amber lamps strategically placed over the display tables. The sound of the rain, tapping softly against the front windows, blended perfectly with the steady heartbeat of the clocks. I walked slowly toward my main workbench, tucked into the brightest corner of the shop. Sitting on the green felt mat, protected under a glass dome to keep the dust out, was my most important project of the last few months. I carefully lifted the glass dome and set it aside. There it was, the 19th century French carriage clock, the exact same piece Jenna had knocked over when she was 10. The one with the cracked enamel dial and the shattered protective glass. She had swept up and hidden out of fear of facing the consequences. For decades, I had kept that broken mechanism in a dark box, like a silent reminder of the structural fractures that happen when cowardice becomes a daily habit. But now, the clock looked entirely different. It had taken me weeks to track down an original beveled crystal in an online auction out of France. I had fully restored the polished brass casing, stripping away the cloudy patina of the years with specialized solvents and microfiber cloths, until the metal gleamed with a blinding golden hue. I had commissioned a master artisan to restore the white enamel dial, filling the hairline crack with ceramic resin until it was entirely invisible, repainting the Roman numerals with a single hair brush. I sat down on the padded wooden stool. I adjusted the articulating lamp so the light hit exactly over the internal movement, which sat naked outside its protective casing. I popped my precision loop over my right eye. I grabbed my favorite titanium tweezers with my right hand and a microscopic vial of synthetic oil with my left. The mechanism was completely assembled, chemically cleaned, and perfectly calibrated. It just needed the final step, the last touch that breathes the soul back into the machine. I dipped the tip of a steel oiler into the vial, picking up a microscopic drop the size of a pinhead, with a pulse that didn't tremble by a fraction of a millimeter. Despite my 73 years, I brought the oiler right to the escape wheel. I deposited the drop of oil exactly on the friction point of the synthetic ruby jewel. I pulled the oiler back, picked up the tiny brass winding key, and slotted it into the mainspring barrel. I turned the key a half rotation, then another half. The mechanical tension coiled into the spring with a soft, incredibly promising metallic click. With the very tip of my tweezers, I gently nudged the balance wheel to give it the initial push. The wheel spun. The pallet fork engaged the teeth of the escape wheel. And then, in the absolute dead silence of my shop, surrounded by the smell of aged wood and the drumming of the rain outside, the carriage clock came back to life. Tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound was fast, brilliant, absolutely flawless. A steady, confident rhythm that filled the empty space between the walls of my new life. I watched the tiny brass gears spinning in perfect harmony, every single one doing its job, every single one carrying the weight of its responsibility. so the steel hands on the other side could push forward across the white enamel dial. There were no defective parts. There was no hidden dust. There was no unnecessary friction. I leaned back against the stool, popped the loop off my eye, and rested it on the workbench. I placed my hands flat on my thighs, smoothing out the dark blue fabric of my dress. I looked at the newly resurrected clock, listening to its metallic heartbeat, a sound that confirmed to me, with the crushing certainty of physics and mechanics, that time is never truly lost.
Sometimes it stops, sometimes it breaks, and sometimes it forces you to completely dismantle the entire structure to find the flaw. But if you have the patience to scrub away the lies, the strength to rip out the people who are rusting you from the inside, and the absolute firmness to tighten the right screws, time always, inexorably, becomes yours again. And now, every single second of my life belonged entirely to me. The profound narrative of Lucy, the 73-year-old watchmaker, offers a deeply moving exploration of dignity boundaries and the immense courage required to reclaim one's life from the jaws of betrayal. Before diving into the deep reflections of this story, it is crucial to state clearly that this story and the commentary created are generated strictly for educational purposes, aiming to inspire personal growth, promote humanistic values, and foster a healthier understanding of personal boundaries. Looking closely at Lucy's journey, we find an incredible blueprint for navigating the complexities of familial entitlement and elder exploitation. Her story is not just about a property dispute. It is a profound lesson on how we allow ourselves to be treated and the invisible labor we often pour into people who view us merely as tools for their own convenience. When we listen to Lucy's calm approach to an incredibly volatile situation, we realize the power of emotional regulation and objective reality. Her son-in-law Mason represents a toxic dynamic many face, an individual built entirely on appearances, using loud arrogance to mask deep incompetence. Too often, out of a desire to keep the peace or protect our families, we accommodate these chaotic energies, adjusting our entire routines, households, and mental well-being to buffer them from the consequences of their own choices. Lucy's daughter Jenna mirrors another tragic human tendency, choosing the cowardice of silence and enabling a parasite because facing the truth is simply too exhausting. But the story beautifully illustrates that when a mechanism is fundamentally broken, no amount of lubrication or invisible sacrifice will make it run smoothly. Applying this to our own lives means recognizing when it is time to stop absorbing the friction of others. We must dismantle the dangerous myth that aging or vulnerability makes a person obsolete or invisible. Lucy didn't scream, cry, or beg when presented with the cruel reality of a cheap nursing home brochure. Instead, she relied on the unshakable truth of her reality, her lifelong craft, and the deep roots she had planted within her local community. This highlights a massive humanistic value. Real power is not built on flashy presentations or borrowed capital, but on decades of honest handshakes, mutual respect, and quiet consistency. When the world tries to shift our boundaries and treat us as a burden, we have the absolute right to take our pieces, our rules, and our tables and completely walk away to protect our inner peace. Personalized humanistic commentary. Life, much like the intricate mechanics of a vintage timepiece, requires us to constantly evaluate the heavy gears that keep our spirits moving forward. We often spend years accommodating the friction of toxic relationships simply because we fear the painful noise of a clean break. However, true human dignity teaches us that we are never a burden for occupying our own rightful space in this world. When we enable the delusions of others at the expense of our own peace,
we are not practicing love, but rather participating in our own slow destruction. Standing up for yourself is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate realization of self-worth and moral clarity. It reminds us that our value does not expire with age, nor does it diminish when others fail to see our invisible labor. True strength lies in the quiet capacity to observe reality objectively, gather your facts, and act with absolute precision when boundaries are crossed. We must learn to let go of the hollow shells of what used to be a family or a home, if those spaces become corrupted by greed and deceit. Forgiveness is a beautiful virtue that heals the soul, but it must never be confused with blind trust that allows a broken mechanism to keep hurting you. True networks of human connection are built through decades of honesty, shared handshakes, and a genuine commitment to the community around us. No matter how deep the betrayal cuts, you possess the innate power to pack up your essential tools, walk out the door, and start a beautiful new chapter. It takes immense courage to look at someone you love and realize that you cannot fix a clock they insist on breaking with a hammer. By choosing reality over convenient illusions, we pave a path toward a healthier, more authentic existence for ourselves and the generations watching us. Ultimately, reclaiming your time means taking full accountability for your happiness and refusing to let anyone else dictate the rhythm of your heart. Let this be a gentle reminder to honor your boundaries, embrace the naked truth, and remember that it is never too late to rebuild a life rooted in peace. Restoring the blueprint of tomorrow. The ultimate triumph in this story is not just the financial windfall Lucy received from selling her property, but the complete restoration of her own timeline. By refusing to pay the bill for someone else's delusions, she demonstrated that human value is absolute and cannot be bartered away by those who view relationships as transactional. She rebuilt her sanctuary, choosing clean foundations over toxic debris, and found a way to pass on her patience and steady hands to the next generation through her grandson Finn. This tells every listener that no matter how late the hour seems or how deep the betrayal cuts, time always belongs to the person who has the courage to live in the truth. Disclaimer: the content provided in this commentary is intended solely for educational, informational, and inspirational purposes. It is based on a narrative text and reflects personal interpretations regarding human behavior, boundaries, and personal development. This commentary does not constitute legal, financial, medical, or psychological advice. Viewers and listeners should consult with qualified professionals regarding specific legal disputes, family counseling, asset management, or mental health concerns. The author assumes no responsibility or liability for any actions taken based on the insights shared in this analysis.